I'm just going to get my slides up. There we go. As the Secretary General said, we just witnessed a defining moment in Paris in the history of the battle against climate change. I think we should all recognize the incredible achievement, particularly of the French presidency of the COP and the UNFCCC, in negotiating an agreement which, as the Secretary General noted, is only a starting point, but is a very critical starting point. And for many observers of this, was probably at the high end of what was considered diplomatically and politically achievable. So what was accomplished? Well, first, there was a major shift in the architecture of the international climate deal from a zero-sum political negotiating game set by top-down targets to a positive-sum, bottom-up process that's creating a competition to show leadership on the climate issue. And there was a continued sense of a ratcheting up of ambition in the agreement, going from the 2-degree target that was set in Cancun in 2010 to a recognition that even 2 degrees is extremely dangerous, and that for many, particularly the least developing countries and low island states, that 1.5 degrees should really be where we're aiming our efforts. Also, quite importantly, a ratcheting mechanism was set to encourage countries to come back every 5 years to take stock of where we are, to measure the size of the gap between what we're doing and what we need to do, and then to encourage countries to ratchet up their ambitions. As the UN Secretary General said, this agreement represents a floor, not a ceiling. Also on funding, progress was made. There was increased recognition of the importance of adaptation, recognition for the damage that particularly developing countries are already suffering in the face of climate change, and further commitment to significant flows of support for developing country climate efforts. But I personally think the biggest shift in this outcome was the shift in the political environment that this is all happening in. And really the global conversation now has moved on from the whether conversation, whether we should do something, to the how conversation. And I see this meeting here over the next couple of days as a very key contribution to that how conversation. And as the Secretary General said, it's very appropriate the first Monday after the COP that we're talking about the how and what do we do next here. Now, just to give a little bit of framing for that how conversation, we should remind ourselves of the challenge of what we need to achieve. Now, the Paris Agreement sets this range between 2 degrees and 1.5 degrees as the ambition for the global agreement. And this chart from the IPCC shows that even in this 1.5 to 2 degree range, we're not in the safe zone. We're still very much on the moderate to significant risk zone in terms of what the scientists think the risks are to the planet from increased warming. Now, if we look then at what leads to actually determining what the peak temperature is, what peak warming is, there's been some very good, relatively recent science showing that actually annual emissions flows is not quite the right way to look at it. And in some ways, the policymaking apparatus and political process is still catching up with this, because most of these nationally determined measures pledged in the Paris Agreement are in terms of annual emissions flows or carbon intensity targets and so on. And it turns out, as this graph shows, that they're actually not a very reliable predictor to what eventual temperature peaking will be. That rather what matters for peak temperature is cumulative emissions. What's the cumulative stock of emissions that we've put into the atmosphere and ocean system and Earth system since the Industrial Revolution? And these cumulative figures turn out to be actually a very strong predictor of where temperatures will peak. Now, one can think of the atmospheric and ocean and Earth climate system as like a bathtub. We have an emissions tap that is running, pouring carbon and other greenhouse gases into the system. And then there's removals from forests and soils and the ocean and forests. And we know that these emissions have been rising quite steadily due to economic growth, to economic development, carbon intensity increasing, and also population growth. And we also know that these net removals have been decreasing. As the oceans saturate with carbon, they can absorb less, and with deforestation and as the planet warms, the soil also releases more gases. Now, where we end up in terms of peak warming is in essence a function of how full this bathtub gets before we stop. And it doesn't matter whether going to 1 degree, 2 degree, or 3 degree. In order for the warming to stop, the bathtub has to stop filling. So this is a point that didn't quite come through as clearly as many scientists would have liked in the Paris Agreement, but we actually have to get to net zero emissions. We can't just cut, it's not a matter of cutting 50%, 80%, 90%. It really is 100%. That net emissions, net between the source and the sink, have to go to zero for this tub to stop filling at any temperature. It doesn't matter whether it's 1 degree, 2 degree, 3 degree, 6, 7, 8. So in order to meet the Paris targets of stabilizing between 1.5 and 2, at some point we're going to have to stop the flows into this tub and go to net zero. That's what the latest science and the IPCC was very clear on. Now, how much room do we have left in this tub? How much space can we keep pumping carbon into the atmosphere? Well, there's also been some recent work on this, and at a maximum, 322 gigatons is about the answer. That gets us to a point where we have a 50-50 chance of making the 2-degree target. So that's the very upper end. Now, I've highlighted here the range of the Paris Accord. It could be, if we're serious about the 1.5 degree target, it could be much, much lower than that. But I'm going to just work at the top end of this scale, what's the maximum, and show you a few charts about what this means. So if we fill the tub absolutely to maximum and we only have a 50-50 chance of hitting 2 degrees, we still may well exceed 2 degrees. What do we have to do? Well, we can think of then this as a budget. We have this 322 left that we can put into the atmosphere. How quickly are we spending down the bank? How quickly are we drawing down our budget? Now, this is probably extremely hard to read. These are a whole bunch of IPCC scenarios and other scenarios because there's great uncertainty as to how fast are emissions growing. So we have to look at a variety of scenarios. But the answer comes out sometime around 2040. We've spent the bank. If we keep going at our current rate. Late 2030s, early 2040s, the atmosphere is full for a 2-degree warming scenario, probably even above that. So not very long. 2040 is not a long time away. Now, myself and my colleagues at Oxford have asked another related question, which is, given that our energy infrastructure tends to hang around for decades at a time, coal plants will go 30, 40, even 50 years, gas plants a little bit less, cars tend to be on the road 10 years or so. Given that huge momentum in our capital stock of emitting infrastructure, how soon do we have to start going to zero carbon on the new stuff? So as we add new power plants, new cars, new buildings, all the investment that we're making in our infrastructure, when does that have to go to zero? And what these curves show is the potential emissions of our the remaining amount of our budget left in this carbon budget, and then how quickly we're spending it down from our infrastructure. And the answer is about now, about 2017. That's when we have to, if we're serious about 2 degrees, that's when we have to start going for all new investment in the energy infrastructure globally, going to net zero. Now, again, being good scientists, my colleagues at Oxford make sure that I show you the range. There is a range and uncertainty on this. Now, it's possible we may have already passed that point. We may have passed it in 2005. We may already be committed with our existing infrastructure to an above 2-degree warming scenario. And at the very optimistic end, we might go out to 2030. But our best estimate is around 2017, 2020. So these results, which are fairly recent results, add a sense of urgency to the challenge that we'll be talking about over the next couple of days that wasn't quite there in Paris. And we need to bring that sense of increased urgency that if we're serious about the ambitions that were set in Paris, if we're serious about the commitments that were set in Paris, then we need to be serious about taking this action to start reducing our investments in energy and other carbon-emitting infrastructure to zero very, very quickly. Now, at the same time, we've also done some work looking at fossil fuels and how much is in the ground versus, again, this bathtub, this carbon budget, how much can we burn? So there's also a stock of emissions sitting in the ground today that someday will get burned and thrown up into the atmosphere. Now, it turns out we've already discovered enough fossil fuels to take us up to 5 degrees, 6 degrees, something like that. We've already discovered more fossil fuels than we can ever possibly burn under the limits in the Paris Agreement. And if you actually add in the coal reserves, not just the coal resources, estimated coal resources, we can see that we are well beyond anything that the planet could possibly handle. So we will reach peak atmosphere long before we reach peak oil or peak coal or peak gas. And this raises an interesting question. If we've discovered more than we can ever burn, why are we still spending $646 billion per year of taxpayer, of all of our money, to discover more? And so this clearly has to be a question.
Mexican wave here for you.
Thank you. Well, and Mexico has worked very hard to reduce its subsidies in line with this. So, this is, I put it in big red flashing letters because I think it's a big question for the, for world leaders and leaders of many of our governments of why are you spending our money on discovering more resources that we can never use or never burn? So we have a set of choices ahead of us coming out of Paris. We can either do what the math tells us we need to do and drive new energy investments to zero starting right about now, and we can stop looking for more fossil fuels, or we're going to build up some big problems for later, and the choices are not good later. We'll either be faced with writing off a big part of our energy sector and replacing it later with zero carbon things, but writing them off before they're at the end of their economically useful life. So if you're investing in a new coal plant today, you're not going to get your money back. You're going to have to write that off at some future point in time. And so as investors, we have to ask, does this make sense? Or we're going to have to take a really big bet on carbon capture and storage, that we can later on sort of clean up the mess and start absorbing carbon out of emissions and out of the atmosphere. And as the Secretary General noted, while those technologies are promising, they're still at an early stage, expensive, and have a lot of risk. Or we blow through the 2-degree threshold. Those are our choices. It's hard to think of any others. That's kind of what's in front of us. Now, some good news from that rather sobering assessment, that the first choice, moving rapidly to a clean energy economy, is actually taking us to a better economy. We're starting to rapidly learn that the products and services of the clean energy economy are actually better products and services. For decades, climate change was positioned as sort of a hair shirt issue where we're all going to have to sacrifice and drive terrible cars and live in terrible houses and eat terrible food if we want to do this. But we're rapidly learning that actually the smart houses are better than regular houses. Smart cities are more livable than regular cities. Electric vehicles turn out to be wonderful. I put a picture of this lovely Tesla at the bottom where you can have a software button on your dashboard called the ludicrous button that if you hit it, you'll go faster than any car should be allowed to go. We have wonderful clean sources of energy that don't create the disease and other problems that fossil fuels create. So not only do we have to go down this route, but we will be better off for going down this route. And we're also learning that the economics of going down this route are a lot more favorable than were initially expected. I'm going to talk about that more in a moment, or actually now. An important reason why this clean energy economy is ultimately going to win, it's only a question of is it soon enough, is because clean energy technologies are technologies. Fossil fuels are commodities. Now, we've done some work at Oxford looking at the very long-term price trends in commodities versus technologies. And we've collected data on hundreds and hundreds of different technologies and commodities. And it turns out that commodities basically don't change in price much over time. They drift around, they bounce up and down in what mathematicians call a random walk, but there's no long-term trend. I'll show you another chart showing that coal in the U.S. basically costs about the same today as what it cost in the late 1800s. Whereas technologies come down in price and up in performance. Think of the smartphones in your pockets and the laptops that you have as being a very visible example of that. But it's not just true for those technologies, it's true for a whole range of technologies. And as I'll show you, clean energy technologies are very much on this kind of a price performance curve. This is a graph showing the price performance curve of solar versus, it's a little hard to see, but that squiggly line at the bottom there is coal. And these are since the technologies began, going back to, in essence, inception, from the first solar panel or the first coal mine. And you can see coal, as I mentioned, has hardly moved in price, whereas solar has dropped exponentially in its relatively short life. And then the red triangles are nuclear. And even though nuclear is also a kind of a technology, it hasn't declined in price largely because of safety and regulatory concerns. But if you look at these two trend lines of coal sort of drifting along and solar rocketing down, if you're an investor, which one of these would you bet on? Now, there's a reason why technologies like solar and wind and batteries and others come down in price over time. It's something called Wright's law, which was discovered by this chap, Theodore Wright, during World War II, when he was looking at why were the costs of bombers and tanks and other things being made in the war coming down so rapidly. And when the planners did their budgets for what the costs of bombers were going to be, et cetera, they way overestimated what those costs would be. And so Wright looked at what happened. Why did these costs drop so much? And it turns out it's what engineers call a learning curve, that as the cumulative production of these things go up, the engineers get busy and they find all kinds of incremental improvements and tweaks, and the prices come down in this exponential or power law function. Being an academic, I had to give you one equation. But what that means is that the price is very much like Moore's law, which we're all familiar with computers, that it means that prices can drop very, very quickly over time, and performance can also ramp up quickly over time. And we've done some work showing that solar is, in fact, following a classic Wright's law curve. And you can then forecast this out with some error bars on it, these red and yellow zones. But it looks highly certain that solar is actually going to be cheaper than coal by sometime in the 2020s and 2030s. And actually, this varies a bit depending on location and how much sun and other factors. But solar is on a pretty good path to start beating coal in the next decade. And I could have showed you similar charts for wind and batteries and other technologies. Now, what allows clean energy technologies to have rapid improvement rates? Well, particularly technologies that have small unit sizes, so you can have lots of experiments. So, you can make lots of different types of solar panels and experiment with different ways of making them. Short times between generations, that the learning process can happen relatively quickly. And also it helps when technologies are embedded in a larger ecosystem of innovation. So, for example, one reason why solar has improved so much is it's benefited from improvements in the semiconductor industry that have filtered through into solar manufacture. And we may also see, even though people are have been recently more bearish on biofuels and biotechnologies, the immense progress being made in the biotech world will also likely start filtering through to that world. And this all speaks to the need for exactly the kind of systems innovation that the OECD has been advocating. And we can see that a whole host of clean energy technologies meet these criteria: solar, wind, batteries, electric vehicles, smart grids, smart homes, and bioengineered fuels. There are some other areas where it's a bit more questionable whether they do. And one of the issues we may find with things like nuclear and CCS is because the unit sizes are so large and the capital investments for the first few is so large that it's very hard for them to get onto that kind of learning curve. Now, given that we can see that these technologies can improve very quickly if the volumes come up and if the research money is spent on them, it creates a very strong imperative to begin shifting R&D and subsidies to clean energy technologies. And this is a chart from the Apollo project led by Nick Stern. And you can see that there's a huge disconnect between what we need to do and what we are doing today. That there's, while there's, the OECD countries spend significant amounts on R&D, only a tiny, tiny fraction of that is going to clean energy technologies. And likewise, as I mentioned before, we have huge subsidies flowing to fossil fuel technologies and much more modest subsidies flowing to clean energy technologies. So we need to have a very major shift in this equation of where the funding is going. Now, we can think of a policy framework for how we stop filling the bathtub in the following way. It's pretty simple. We want to make the good stuff cheap and better and make the bad stuff expensive. And it just kind of comes down to that at the end of the day. And how do we make the good stuff cheap? Well, we need to dramatically scale up investments in R&D, but not only just the dollar amounts, but as the OECD has advocated and as will be discussed in detail here over the next couple of days, we need to do it smarter, creating systems of innovation and embedding clean energy into these larger ecosystems of innovation and policy frameworks. And we also need to take steps that will drive up the cumulative volumes of low-carbon energies. To me, that's become the key test of whether a policy will work. Is it going to drive the volume up and help us drive down Wright's law curve? So, and there's various ways to do it, each with pros and cons: subsidies, feed-in tariffs, renewable portfolio standards, building codes. And one lever that hasn't really been used much to date is government purchasing. In other industries, the military, semiconductors, and so on, government purchasing was actually a key part of getting technologies down the Wright's law curve, and we should take a closer look at how it can be used here. And then also getting rid of the barriers to deployment, smart grid investments, electric vehicle charging infrastructure. There's a whole host of regulatory burdens. The Secretary General mentioned some of them that need to be removed. And then on making the bad stuff expensive, as I mentioned, getting rid of subsidies would be a very good place to start. We may have carbon prices have been a bit dead in the water for the last decade or so, but we may have renewed opportunities to look at those. And there's been some good research showing that voters and consumers are actually quite accepting and even positive on them as long as they're upstream. If they're directly downstream in my pocketbook, I tend not to like them so much. But if they're upstream at the level of the utility or the mining company or petroleum company, voters and consumers tend to be much more enthusiastic. Now, as an economist, I have to say it all kind of comes out in the wash and consumers end up paying for it one way or another. But there is an important psychology from a policy standpoint to how these things are implemented. Also, there's some very good work going on to encourage the full disclosure of the risks built into many companies from having stranded assets. Oil companies with oil that will never be burned, coal companies with coal that will never be burned, utilities that are not planning for a low-carbon future that will face stranded assets, and so on. And making investors aware of the risks in their portfolio from this is an important step. And Mark Carney, Bank of England governor and chairman of the Financial Stability Board at COP21, announced a major initiative to start creating reporting standards and disclosure of that risk that Michael Bloomberg is going to chair. And then also, one of the things that has actually helped tip the balance in the favor of renewables in many countries has been getting much tougher on public health regulations for fossil fuels and air quality. Air pollution standards, mercury and heavy metal regulations, things like that, ensure that the fossil fuel companies are starting to pay for the health problems that these power sources create, and that also tilts the playing field more in the favor of clean energy technologies. So, where do we go from here? Well, the UNFCCC process is now sort of set on a path for the next 5 years, and we'll reconvene in 5 years to take stock of progress and hopefully ratchet up the contributions of the participating countries. But in the meantime, there's a lot to be done, both at the practical and policy level, but also at the political level, too. And here I think the G20 could play a very important role in building off of the momentum of Paris. This is my G20 wish list. It may not be a politically realistic list, but it's at least good to have the wish list out there. That there's that there should be a G20 clear commitment to net zero, because again, this issue was a bit fudged in Paris. A clear commitment to net zero would send a very strong signal to business and investors that this is the path we're going on, and that if you're making investments that are not net zero, you should think again as to whether your money is being put to good use. Also, a major effort to get rid of fossil fuel subsidies, and looking at the potential to get some pledges or commitments to start winding down new investment in fossil fuel technologies in the coming decade, and also upping the ante in pledges for investments in R&D. And I think given how small they are today, even a 10x increase would be fairly modest. Now, I realize that this may be on the outer limits of what's politically feasible with the G20, but I'm hopeful because many of the G20 members played a key role in Paris in what was called the High Ambition Coalition. And I'm hoping that High Ambition Coalition will continue to work together over the coming years. So given that it is the Christmas holidays, this is what I'll be asking Santa Claus for my Christmas present. Thank you very much.